Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have two very special guests to join me on this investigation into a very interesting character. Not a lot of people know about. Not I didn't know much about him. His name was Thomas Creech, but we have George from CAVDEF and Todd Wood of Killafornia. And George and I have done a couple shows in the past. We've done one. We did one that I just reposted recently, actually, which is about the life and death of Satanist Michael Aquino, and that was with John Brisson and some other characters, some other guys. And then George and I, back in 2021, we did a discussion about the Atlanta child murders. There's a lot more to that story. But I was talking to Todd from Killafornia. We've done a lot of shows. Todd and I are probably on 7 or 8 episodes. But we were talking, and he's the one who kind of brought it to my mind, this guy Thomas Creech, who I hadn't heard about, but his connections and some stuff. And then I read, or I saw on social media, that George had posted about Creech and some interesting connections. I think the audience, people listening, will find pretty amazing. But I learned that, and then I read George had done a lot of research on Creech, and so I thought I should do a show on this guy. We should do a show. So I invited George and Todd to be on the show. So I'm glad to have them. We're going to talk about this interesting. I've titled this show "The Dark Saga of Satanic Hitman, Thomas Creech." So welcome, both Todd and George.
Thank you.
Awesome. So for people who may not have, I think a lot of people know Todd. George, maybe you can talk about your research into Creech, how you got started, and then we can just kind of go from there about his history. He ended up getting arrested at a very young age, 24, 25, but he was involved in a lot of nefarious activities, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first time that I came across him was actually reading Dave McGowan's book, Program to Kill, which, really sort of examines, I think a lot of people here are familiar with it, but for those who are not, it, examines a lot of these mainstream, well-known serial killer cases, people like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and, sort of looks into whether there was more to the story, whether there were these people, whether they really acted alone or whether they had more people involved with them, whether some of these murders might have had additional motives beyond just, being these random, sadists going after, victims fairly arbitrarily. And so, to sort of give a backstory, an example of, that made McGowan's theory plausible at one point in the book, I think with the epilogue of his book, he mentioned this guy, Thomas Creech, and mentioned how Thomas Creech claimed to be was a serial killer, but claimed to be this essentially hitman for a satanic cult and biker gang group that basically, that he was a serial killer, but he was doing some of his murders for hire for specific purposes. And this sort of lines up with what McGowan was alleging happened in a lot of other cases. So that was kind of how I first came across it. And then while I was doing research into Ted Bundy, I also came across mentions that the police were investigating these occult connections to the Ted Bundy case, and one of these connections actually involved Creech. That Thomas Creech had made some claims that he was part of a larger cult that was responsible for the murders in the Pacific Northwest that were ultimately attributed to Ted Bundy. And so that caught my attention. And then someone in the Program to Kill community, programtokill.net, which is a website run by the LOL Field and Love channel, Patrick, who does
right.
His YouTube channel got taken off. He had to start a new one. It's Deliberately Strange now. Okay. Shout out to Patrick from programtokill.net. Everybody, it's a great place to find research material if anybody's looking into this subject. Go ahead. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, I absolutely co-sign all of that. As an amazing researcher, and there's a really good community of people who have formed around him. There's a forum on his website where a lot of people are contributing stuff, and I think someone ended up sending him this article on Thomas Creech in We Magazine, that's OUI, by a journalist named Michael Reynolds. It was called The All-American Death Angel, who did a really sort of detailed expose of Creech's life, and goes over all of this stuff about him being involved in the satanic cult and this whole murder for hire underground crime ring. And so that whole expose of his life was very interesting to me when it was all laid out there, and also because of how many parallels it had to the Henry Lee Lucas story, which I was into as well. So really, Creech just comes up as a sort of archetype, a really clear-cut example of this whole Program to Kill phenomenon, one of the rare people who really, is in this world and is explicitly talking about what it's like to be in that world.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and this is all taking place as this kind of apex of serial killing and murders and just general craziness in America were taking place, right? So, but he was a young guy, but his connections, and by the way, the guy Michael Reynolds you mentioned, he talked to Creech, so he had first person kind of information. According, you had to take it with a grain of salt, but also you had to, and it was a skin mag, so kind of like Playboy. And back for people who are younger, they may not appreciate, like, you didn't have forums or places where you could kind of talk to other people. A lot of these kind of more edgy articles and investigative journalism could be published in alternative magazines or skin mags like Playboy or Penthouse or We. So, so I think
I swear I got it for the articles, but in this case, it's actually a very good article.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Oh, yeah. Very helpful.
But he started young at killing. Like, he was kind of like a sociopath. Would you describe Creech as a sociopath?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about that. I mean, and obviously, like you said, his claims have to be taken with a grain of salt as to how many, all the different claims of murders that he committed and different circumstances of his life. But there is about a dozen murders he committed that are absolutely confirmed. And even, if he's, someone who's lying to inflate their death count beyond that, I mean, obviously has something wrong with them already if you would willfully brag about doing even more than you actually did. And I think, the record of the murders that he is confirmed to have done, I mean, sometimes killing people with no apparent provocation, people, some of the people who he killed were, people in this world of, organized crime, it would appear, but then you also just have completely, random victims with no apparent connection to any of this, a store clerk in Oregon, a young woman, and, a lot of victims like that as well. I think ultimately he very much seems to be a remorseless killer and, seems to have developed that sort of mindset from a young age.
Right. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask a question. Is it true that information that Creech gave to the authorities led them to skulls during the occult investigation?
You're referring to the Pacific Northwest stuff, basically.
Yes.
So that part of it is, one of the things in the article that is, I believe it happened a little bit different from how it's reported. There, the skulls had already been found in some of them were found in the late 1974, September of 74. I think some others were found early in 1975. However, Creech did supply information that led to another relevant scene that had not been discovered previously, that he described this house in Burien, Washington, which is the suburb of Seattle. It's right by the Seattle airport. He described this house where these rituals allegedly took place, and his instructions were actually, his description was detailed enough that it allowed the authorities to locate this house. And when they went in the house, they found that it was pretty much exactly as he had described. There was a basement that had bloodstains on the wall and also had a pentagram on the wall. So there were, things about this whole Washington, the alleged murders that took place in Washington that he was discussing, and his claim of being part of it did match up with, things that were found to be true.
Interesting. I was listening to your the Program to Chill interview about the Hand of Death, and you were saying a lot of these murders were sort of ritualistic, occult ritual sacrifice. I was just wondering, as someone who researches the 4P and has gotten into like the Hand of Death, as you know, what Henry Lee Lucas describes to Max Call, according to Max Call in that interview that's on the programtokill.net, what he describes as sort of an Aztec style of human sacrifice. It's also described, the Aztec methodology of human sacrifice is also described in The Family by Ed Sanders with the 4P cult. Are we seeing a similar type of thing with the heart removal, heart consumption type of deal, or has it varied at this point?
Yeah, I mean, that is a very good question. I'll be honest, I don't know that Creech himself, that when he was describing the methodology of sacrifice, it's not, I mean, it's not talked about in a lot of detail in a lot of the sources that I've read, probably for the benefit of the readers, beyond just the fact that, decapitation was mentioned as part of it when he was talking about the Seattle area murders. But I
Ooh.
can't say too much more about the specifics of it. I think what is relevant, though, is that since you mentioned the Aztec method, there was a story in the Seattle press, not long, a couple years into the whole, the missing women in the Pacific Northwest thing, all these cases that were attributed to Bundy, and they were talking about this police file that the Seattle police were gathering into occultism in the area. It was called File 1004. It was cataloging a lot of these incidents, including the whole Thomas Creech thing, and there was mention of various local cult activity. There were allegations that this person Ted, who had not been identified at the time, but of course would later be identified as Ted Bundy, that he was involved in cult activity, and there were tips sort of talking about him being into these Aztec type rituals. So that does come up in that regard, at least. And
that's very, very interesting. Well, even with the decapitation, I mean, what we discussed with the last episode of Killafornia we did with Dana Dudall, shout out to Dana Dudall. We talked about the Chingon slash Shingon, the possibility that it's Shingon slash Chingon. And in Aztec culture, I would refer you back to the episode that we did. But the word Chingon, if you kind of take it down to its base, it's he who takes heads, basically. So the decapitation thing has its place in Aztec culture just as well.
Right.
That is very fascinating. Now I also have another question for you. And this is sort of part of the whole thing in Washington State. You talk about another killer, Gary Addison Taylor, but I was just wondering, considering the interviews that Kenneth Mad Dog McKenna did and his claim of going up to Washington State, is it possible that Kenneth Mad Dog McKenna was killing with Creech as well as part of that cult? According to his claims, going up to Washington State and killing people, drifters, hookers, and whatnot.
I think it's definitely possible. The thing with Mad Dog McKenna and his claims about the involvement in the Hand of Death and allegedly teaching Ted Bundy these satanic practices, it's the sort of thing definitely could be true. It's the sort of thing that I would want to see more evidence on. And I haven't looked a ton of into Mad Dog McKenna. And part of the thing is, he was with Gerard Schaefer, and Gerard Schaefer was really into this whole killer fiction thing.
Right.
More reason to not necessarily know how much of this is just them spinning a story, to sort of entertain or titillate themselves and others in jail, and how much of it was true. I certainly think it could be true, but I would agree with you that one of the things that sticks out to me when McKenna talks about it, that he says, "Oh, I taught Bundy these satanic rituals, but I also, but Bundy was just doing it as a lone wolf. He was doing it by himself," and that certainly never sat right with me. So I think that if there was a connection, it was in the context of a large cult, and I kind of have generally been inclined to believe that this Hands of Death cult and the operation that Creech was part of was basically one and the same, and also that all this stuff with the process is probably the same cult as well. It's just different names for the same thing.
That's interesting. That's what Dana thinks too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think she's absolutely right. And yeah, she does great work on stuff. And
She does.
I mean, I think she has at one point, I'm pretty sure showed an interview with the girlfriend of Victor Wilde, a process member, on her show. And this girlfriend of Victor Wilde had given information to the police in California talking about how basically he ran this sort of biker group, and this biker group was involved in essentially organized crime activities, and even would sort of meet periodically to discuss contract murders that they would commit. And also, of course, that members of the Manson family were involved with Victor Wilde's group as well. And this certainly is interesting because of how, Creech's description of the network, where he is affiliated with these different biker groups throughout America, and that they're receiving these contracts to carry out for various organized crime purposes, effectively at the behest of drug lords. Creech is saying something in his story that's very similar to what Victor Wilde's girlfriend was saying in her story. And it's two different stories, told at different times. It's unlikely that Creech would have seen this story himself in some way, and yet it matches up very precisely. So, sign that it's the same pattern repeating.
Right. No, Creech was he was working for Peter. Correct me if I'm wrong. Was it Peter Simon, the hotel owner in Las Vegas?
That was one of the people who he named as boss of his. Peter Simon was allegedly one of them. That was what Creech claimed. And yeah, Simon was a casino owner in the Vegas area. You got in. I mean,
I'm sorry. What hotels or what casino did he own? I was just curious.
So originally it was something in Jean, Nevada called Pop's Oasis. Then he got into business with some more, I think, like even more prominent casino owners, and he ended up founding a new one, which actually ended up merging with the Circus, which was a pretty well-known, I think, pretty popular one in Las Vegas, and then that eventually became the Mandalay Resort Group, and then that was bought by MGM. So he eventually got involved with very major casinos there in Vegas. And
interesting.
Yeah,
fascinating.
He now runs this investment firm, one of the things that he's investing in is this AI company, which as the founder of that AI company was on a geospatial intelligence foundation. So that's interesting as well.
Yes, that's very interesting. Very interesting indeed. Just out of curiosity, in that Program to Chill interview you did, you talked about Gary Addison Taylor and Ionia Hospital and the doctor who was treating Gary Addison Taylor. Am I saying that name correctly?
Yeah.
Okay. Was also involved in the Boston Strangler case?
Yeah, that's right. So it was Dr. Ames Roby. He was a doctor at Bridgewater State Hospital in Massachusetts. He had treated not only Albert DeSalvo, the alleged Boston Strangler, but also, I think one of the alternate suspects, Peter Howard Denton. And he had sort of, he believed that DeSalvo was completely innocent, but I also do believe that there was probably some degree of, just my suspicion, Bridgewater Hospital has a very dark history. There's a guy on Twitter, Boltzmann Booty, who has a good thread on that, and signs of probable mind control experiments that were happening at Bridgewater, and so it's hard to believe that Ames Roby, who I think was like the director of treatment there, or some other high level position, didn't know about it. But then Ames Roby moves over to Michigan to be the head of the Center for Center for Forensic Psychiatry. One of the people there is Gary Addison Taylor, who has up until this point been in and out of various mental hospitals and prisons for all sorts of offenses. Like he was known as a Royal Oak sniper, just randomly shooting at people in the Detroit area. So he was constantly in and out. And then eventually Ames Roby, sort of makes a decision to let him go free. And then also, Taylor immediately sort of absconds from any sort of supervision not long after that. And he is, really no alarms get raised. So that very suspicious handling, at the very least, fairly careless handling of someone like Gary Addison Taylor.
That's very interesting. Very interesting.
You can't leave out that Creech was also in a mental ward as well, too.
Yes, he was.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, well, it's interesting that one of the places that Creech had served time in the mental ward, I think it's the Chillicothe prison in Ohio, was actually the same prison where previously both Charles Manson and Henry Lee Lucas had served time during the 1950s. And apparently Manson, he had claimed while he was at Chillicothe to have met this guy named Toby, who was a Satanist, and taught him the art of mental manipulation and hypnosis, stuff like that. So that's very interesting as well, that 3 of these killers, who were all allegedly involved with these satanic cults, all passed through the same prison in Ohio.
Yeah.
Wow. That's
that is crazy.
And also, hypnosis is involved in the trial. So when they arrested Creech, they put him through all of the kind of standard sodium pentothal hypnosis, which is very suspicious and very strange. But his polygraph is there. I guess he passed his polygraph. But I want to know who the doctors were who treated Creech when they got arrested in 75 during the trial. I don't know yet, but
me too.
We'll keep looking into it. Not to take us too off subject, it's also interesting with the Boston Strangler stuff. I believe that same hospital, George Nasser was there, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
Hitman, another hitman. It seems like with this satanic cult stuff that Creech was involved with, there's also an element of intelligence and an element of organized crime. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I would personally agree with that. I think, obviously it's sometimes hard to discern, definitive evidence of that, hidden hand of intelligence behind all of it. But I would agree that it's very likely there. I mean, based on how uniformly this same sort of story, keeps popping up. Other interesting facts, like for example, the fact that Creech claimed to have supplied drugs to the Symbionese Liberation Army at one point as one of the jobs that he was contracted to do. That's talked about in that We magazine article. And of course, the SLA is almost certainly this, CIA project, effectively this, faux, left-wing revolutionary group that is, committing this, blatant sort of terrorism, kidnapping a wealthy heiress and all of that. So yeah, there are signs like that of an intelligence connection. And also, interestingly, that Thomas Creech had once claimed that he and Ted Bundy both received instruction in the occult from a University of Washington professor who was in fact known to work for intelligence, work for the CIA front effectively.
That's interesting. Is this the gentleman who we suspect sent the letters to Anne Rule, Egil Krogh, who was the Watergate lawyer?
No, it was the guy who was the head of the Mankind Research Unlimited, the Western division of that.
Schneider.
So Carl Schleicher was the head of Mankind Research Unlimited, but the Western, the Pacific Northwest Regional Division head was a guy named Richard Allen Miller. He was at the University of Washington Experimental College. He taught classes on the occult and, magic and astrology and parapsychology and all these different subjects. And Creech had claimed to be taking, basically claimed that he and Bundy were both in a class taught by him. And so, knowing that Miller was part of this effectively intelligence front that was part of MK Ultra, and that they were taking a class from him is also, provocative to say the least. It doesn't. These operations are so compartmentalized. It doesn't mean that Miller was into, any of this other, cult murder stuff, but it does suggest that there is this sort of hidden hand that keeps following these people, and crucially as well, linking up these different serial killers into the same sort of organization.
Right. Oh man, that's a lot to take in. That's just some wild stuff.
And for people who don't know, Creech went to Haight-Ashbury in 1966, so he was there, befriended the Hells Angels, so that's the time around when Hunter S. Thompson's around there, and then also ran into Sandor LaVey and attended 2 satanic rituals in late 1966. So this is all it. So Walpurgis Night and all this other stuff, and according to that author, Michael Reynolds, who wrote The All-American Death Angel, he said Tom was enormously impressed by LaVey and became a firm believer in the reality of Satan and Satan's powers. Direct quote.
Man.
So that's 66. That's not even up to 74. You got to think about it in the context of all these killings. And I think Bundy's killing people in 74 too. So all this strange stuff, it kind of overlaps. It's really something else. For some reason, whether suspicious or not, is like this Creech guy's left out of some of these conversations. They see these serial killers only as kind of independent. I think it's a mistake. And they knew each other. Like you mentioned Schroeder or whatever his name was, Sheriff Schaefer, he knew Bundy, like he knew about Bundy's crimes and like compared himself to Bundy because it takes one to know one. He's telling that Bundy didn't do doubles, I did doubles, and all this horrible stuff. So
right, and also I believe it was Stanley Benson claimed that he was killing with Bundy as well, right?
Yeah, that's actually, and that's one of the other things that's kind of a sign, one of the many signs in my personal views, that Ted Bundy did not, I mean, obviously was a mass murderer, but in my view did not act alone and was part of a network that involved these other killers. And yeah, if Stanley Bernson, who is another serial killer in Washington State, and I think other Pacific Northwest states, that he had claimed that he and Bundy used to run together and they committed murders together. So you have one serial killer claiming he and Bundy were together. You have another serial killer, Creech, making more or less the same sort of claim that he and Bundy were both learned the occult together, were both at these ritual sacrifices together. And, it matches up with some other things that came up in the Seattle police files. There were accounts early on into these young women going missing before anyone knew what had exactly happened. There were independent accounts saying that it was a local religious cult that was responsible for these murders, that someone who claimed to be a supplier of hallucinogenic drugs claimed to be aware of this and was telling police about this. So you hear the same sort of story about the murders that are ultimately attributed to Bundy, and there are many signs that there were a lot of, there were multiple other people who were sort of in the same group as Bundy. There are other, suspicious occurrences that kind of back this up. Like, for example, there was a serial killer named, well, I would say a suspected potential killer, but a sort of known drifter named Hugh Joseph Michael Tamos, who was in Seattle at, the same time that Bundy was. And then later on, when one of the murders attributed to Ted Bundy was the murder of Karen Campbell in Aspen, Colorado, at the Snowmass Resort. And what's interesting is that at the same time the credit card receipts placed Bundy in the area, the same guy, Hugh Joseph Michael Tamos, who was in Seattle at the same time as Bundy, happens to have moved out to Aspen and is working at various resorts, hotels, and is in fact sighted at the same inn where the victim disappears from on the day that she disappears. And then he, quits his job the next day and leaves town right after that the murder. So interesting that you have this character who is in Seattle at the same time as Bundy, and then he ends up in another city, in another state at the same time that Bundy is there. So you have many indications that Bundy was sort of networking with other people as these crimes were happening.
And now that's sort of the same as Ann Rule, correct? Like Ann Rule would move, according to a conversation you had on another podcast that was on the Deliberately Strange channel now, but programtokill.net. Wasn't she in the same states at the same time as Ted?
Well, that was what Ann Rule herself claimed in her book. She was saying, it's crazy that, Bundy and I, she was saying, that fate had brought them together or something like that. And she was saying, it's funny that actually we had lived in the same states as each other several times, even before we met for the first time, which is also a very weird sort of occurrence. And kind of recalls this quote by the New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, who was investigating the Kennedy assassination, sort of talking about the nature of these covert operations. I actually have it as the header quote in my my Twitter account. He basically says, "I knew by now that when a group of individuals gravitated toward one another for no apparent reason, or a group of individuals that inexplicably headed in the same direction as if drawn by a magnetic field, or coincidence piled on coincidence too many times, as often as not, the shadowy outlines of a covert intelligence operation were somehow becoming visible." And I think that's a very useful analytic tool when you're looking at this sort of program to kill type of phenomenon.
Wow, yeah, amazing. I'm looking at this guy, Richard Allen Miller, his bio. He is a member of the OTO.
Oh,
so, yeah, OTO member, and opened a bookshop in 1972. He called Beltane Occult Books and Supplies.
Okay. They make in file 1004. They also make reference to Stanley Dean Baker. Now,
yes,
the interesting thing about that case compared to others is one, how sensational it is. Pulling the finger out of the pocket, claiming he has a problem, he's a cannibal. But the fact that he only does 15 years and then sort of disappears with no parole or anything, like the state of Montana breaking their own rules in a sense. What do you make of that? Is he really part of the same cult? I think, he kind of pays homage to the Grand Chingon, or pays allegiance to the Grand Chingon. And as you know, I like to look into like the 4P and all that. But do you think he's connected to all this stuff with Creech and Bundy as well?
I mean, I'm inclined to say yes. I mean, the fact that, how would he even know about the Grand Chingon in the first place without,
Right.
Having some degree of connection to these people? And I mean, like you say, the curious way that he was handled in prison afterwards. I believe he ended up in prison in Arkansas later and was on this. I found some story, news story. I have to go back and check. It's been a while since I looked at it, but like I think he was in an Arkansas prison. He was on a work release, and then the dead dogs started suspiciously turning up in the area right around that time that he was let out on work release. So I think that there is a very good chance, in my opinion, that he was part of the same sort of cult. Whether he met these people, I think this cult is, to the extent that it's a nationwide thing, is so compartmentalized, that there are different sort of cells around the country.
Right.
I think that, this same thing repeats in a lot of jurisdictions, and it's the same pattern that you have these sort of, low life, dirtbag types. You get into this petty crime and you hook up with the right person, and you get a sort of opportunity, or what looks like an opportunity, to connect with the big time, to be, part of this quote unquote prestigious group, to be doing these jobs and getting recognition and getting access to drugs and maybe potentially even getting paid for some of what you've done. And that's how these people get drawn into it.
Right. That's interesting. It makes a lot of sense too. Yeah, I just thought it was so strange how sensational that case was compared to the month before with Stephen Hunn, and doing a similar type of murder to the Florence Nancy Brown, heart removal, heart consumption type of stuff, kind of the monkey see, monkey do type of thing. If you were in the crowd at one of these 4P meetings, so says the person Ed talked to in prison, who claims that the Chingon himself visited him in jail. Yeah, it's in chapter 15 of the 2002 edition. I don't know if you guys have read that one yet. Of the family.
Of the family,
yeah. Definitely worth taking a look at. There's a lot more information in that one.
That's interesting. I guess, you get the process chapter gets cut out, but it sounds like there is some good stuff at least that gets added on later to balance.
Oh, for sure. And Stephen Hunn refers to the Grand Chingon as his guru. The interesting thing about that is one of the people associated in this sort of satanic cell that Hunn was associated with is his name is Herman Taylor. I don't know if you heard that name, but he was in Oregon. That's where he's from. But he turned state evidence. So whether it was either Hunn who talked to Ed, or who Ed was working for, Paul Fitzgerald, or if it was Herman Taylor, I'm really not sure. But I kind of lean towards Mr. Hunn, Stephen Hunn, who died in 2005 of a brain aneurysm.
I actually had not really. I think I vaguely heard the name. I don't think I've ever looked at him at all. So I'll
send you what I have.
Yeah, please do. I mean, I think any concrete examples of this sort of, cult phenomenon happening are important to run down, just because, it's important when you see stories like this, there's always a tendency to say, well, this person just making some stuff up. But I think at some level, when it repeats enough times from independent people talking about it and over multiple years, it's hard to deny that there's something to it all.
Right. Another really interesting thing, again, I kind of been following the methodology right now. They say follow the money, but it's the Magdalena Solis cult. Or you could call it the Hernandez religious sect in Mexico in 1963. Same methodology of human sacrifice, but heart removal, heart consumption. And in this cult, the children, they were selling into sex slavery. In, guess where? Monterey. Does that sound familiar? Like where Henry and Otis were taking kids and women, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just disturbing how much, you hear about this thing happening, and it's so horrible you don't really want to believe it could be. But I mean, once again, it's you have it from too many sources to deny that it's going on. And I mean, the network of child trafficking down in Mexico is horrifying, and it's one of the things that, I mean, I think is a clear sign that Henry Lee Lucas was on target with what he was saying as well.
Right. I'll send you the information I have on her as well. It'd probably just be a Wikipedia page. There's some articles that are just in Spanish, and I'm not very good at reading Spanish. But yeah, there's that. I thought that was very interesting. But yeah, it seems like all these guys are sort of connected, and this is really just a countrywide drug and criminal occult network.
Yeah. What's another sort of important, major sign of it, which was actually one of the things that really made me super interested in Thomas Creech and his story, was the fact that his sort of description of the specifics of how this network operates are actually eerily similar to how Henry Lee Lucas describes, in that both Henry Lee Lucas and Thomas Creech describe the auto transport industry as being a sort of important part of this. So basically, these companies that you could pay to sort of drive your car for you, from point A to point B in the U.S. That allegedly these auto transport businessmen were sort of complicit. They were using their company as a front for transporting contraband, whether it's stolen cars or whether it's drugs that are being packed into the cars and driven, that the auto transport people are using their own firms as a part of this organized crime operation. And Creech talks about this, and he describes, his that basically this was sort of how he ended up getting into contact with the major bosses who would give him these murder contracts. That he claims Peter Simon was one of the people who was contracting him with these auto transport companies, and also names a businessman out of Salt Lake City, Vernon Richards, who was a known investor in the auto transport company that's named by Creech. And Henry Lee Lucas himself describes similar sort of thing, that he is recruited by this guy Don Metric, who initially offers him, Don Metric being an auto transport businessman in Louisiana, who initially offers him a job driving stolen cars, and then when Lucas doesn't want to do that, then Don Metric sort of gives him the opportunity to join the Hands of Death cult instead. And interestingly enough as well, this is a developing thing for me, but I actually looking into the background of the auto transport company named by Creech, the same people who ran that company have a company in basically this other sort of auto transport related or car repossession company, which happens to be based both in, it's not based in that many places. It only exists in a couple states, but two of the locations where it exists are Miami, Florida, and also in Louisiana, which are the two locations where Lucas claimed Don Metric was active. So there may, in fact, be a more direct connection that Creech is literally describing the same group of people that recruited Lucas. That's developing for me, but very interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. If I'm remembering The Ultimate Evil correctly by Maury Terry, William Mincer also had his own sort of car business.
Oh, wow. I didn't even remember that. But
also, as somewhere on CAVDEF, I was going through the Philip Arthur Thompson stuff. One of the people who contributed to CAVDEF, they made the claim that Philip Arthur Thompson had his own car lot. Is that correct?
I believe that is correct. Yeah, I think that was probably me who put that on there. I think that there were some old news articles that talked about Philip Arthur Thompson, having this car lot. And
now that, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yes, no, I was just going to say, and Thompson was Satanist as well.
Right.
Victims, sort of before she disappeared, recounted him and his friends having satanic, parties in a San Francisco apartment that they ran.
Yeah, I think that my opinion, and it's probably my opinion alone, but I think that Philip Arthur Thompson and his two buddies make a pretty good suspect for this one murder that I'm looking into. Is that Diane Brown, this young lady in 1981 who came from a party in the San Fernando Valley on New Year's Eve, who wanted to be taken to her sister's house in Huntington Beach. It gets dropped off at the Santa Ana off ramp or on ramp, or to go to Santa Ana from San Fernando Valley. She ends up dead and dismembered, but the hands were never found. I kind of suspect Philip Arthur Thompson of that. She's last heard from hanging out with a bunch of guys in Pomona, Riverside County. And, I don't think that's not too far away, especially in the 1980s from the Cabazon Reservation, where all that other stuff was going on with the octopus and whatnot. Right. But I was also going to bring up that's really interesting about the car lots, because of if I recall some of the Iran-Contra stuff, there were two Nicaraguans who owned car lots in Miami. According to what's that game with Gary? What's the book with Gary Webb?
Dark Alliance.
Dark Alliance. According to Dark Alliance, that might be something worth looking into, unless you've already done it.
I have not, but that is an interesting thing to bring up, and I think that probably it is. I mean, it, like with the whole satanic, and the murder for hire angle, it's the sort of thing that can plausibly be replicated all throughout the country, because if it works for this criminal enterprise, it makes sense that they would keep doing it. So I think it's very likely that finding people in this sort of illicit world who are using these auto transfer companies and used car lots, I think is very common thing. I've heard about it in a couple other contexts in relation to stuff that's happening in Boulder, Colorado, tied to the John Benet Ramsey case. I think, trying to think what else, I think one of the early major people involved in the Gulf cartel, and that was, Mexican cartel, would later be affiliated with the satanic killings by Adolfo Constanzo in the late 80s, that the guy who ran the Gulf cartel was initially got a start in transporting stolen cars. So that's the thing that seems to come up a lot.
Well, it's interesting that you brought that up, because to go back to Magdalena Solis for a while, she was from right underneath Matamoros.
Wow.
And we have to ask the question, the Hernandez brothers, although Hernandez is a common last name in Latin America, we have to ask, is there some sort of connection between Magdalena's Hernandez, like a familiar connection, and Adolfo's Hernandez?
The reason why Adolfo Costanzo located to Matamoros is because he knew there was satanic activity in that area.
So right.
Part of it, yeah.
Well, and another really interesting thing is, we need to perhaps cross-reference where Adolfo was staying in Miami, where how far away was he to the video store that Frank Sturgis owned? Because it was also, I believe, Frank Sturgis spent some time in the Everglades training some of those guerrillas and whatnot at the training camp where Henry Lee Lucas was, right? Like a paramilitary type of thing.
Yeah, that is one of the things that validates Lucas' story, that it's known that these anti-Castro Cuban groups, were being trained by the CIA in the same area in the Everglades where Lucas claims that he was being trained by the hands of death. So,
right, and that's what Sturgis did. That was his main thing. And Sturgis worked as a bagman for Santos Tropicante Jr.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and Miami, and especially that era, has got to be like the most spooked up and mobbed up place, probably like the worst place in the country for all of that together you could think of. It's just insane in that era.
Right. Well, how crazy would it be if Adolfo bought his copy of The Believers from Frank Sturgis's video store?
Man, I would.
Yeah.
I would not. Nothing could shock me at this point, just based on how so much of the stuff seems to connect in weird ways. We could go on forever. Going back to Creech, for example, he talks about this ranch out in Los Angeles, Malibu, called the McCoy Ranch.
Right.
And he, claims, that there were satanic rituals happening there. And what's interesting is that he didn't just, if you're going to claim that he just threw this, made this up, what's interesting is that the Los Angeles authorities had already been interested in this ranch, because they already had reports independently that this was going on, and they actually wanted to talk to Creech because they believed he could be a witness to this sort of thing. But some of the allegations about what was happening in the McCoy Ranch actually tied back to the what Charles Manson and his group was involved in. So once again, I mean, these different people who are supposedly just these isolated instances of random violence are seemingly crossing over in each other's stories to an unbelievable degree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right.
For
Latigo Canyon really isn't that far from the Hinman murders in Topanga Canyon. It's like the adjoining canyon,
Right.
and it's right past Malibu. So it's probably pretty pricey these days, but back then, completely different, much more rural environment too. But according to this article that I read, Creech claimed that more than 100 bodies were buried at the ranch, and Los Angeles Sheriff's Office subsequently backhoed the acreage at an expense of $40,000. The official release claimed that only a ham bone was found, but police also discovered a gilt-framed photograph of a character well known as a sleazy practitioner of Satanism and as the operator of an S&M occult disco in Hollywood. I wonder what that is. And California investigators are still keeping their files open on this case, so I'd be interested to find out where those files are.
Yeah, I really have been trying to find that out. I mean, honestly, California in general, but especially Los Angeles County is really bad at anything relating to public records. In my experience, it's unfortunate, but I mean, I'm certainly not going to stop digging on that. And could be, I mean, buried deep in the archives, some Manson-related file or something. I would be very interested. Maybe our mutual friend Dana might find something relating to the McCoy Ranch and her own work.
You never know. He made statements. Creech made statements about prominent businessmen, Nevada, Utah, like you mentioned, Colorado, plus a United States senator and 2 governors involved in this stuff, and also implicated well-known political personages in his polygraph tale of the ritual sacrifice scene. So, look, this is heavy-duty stuff. This guy's crossing between being a sociopathic murderer, a drug runner, an occultist who knew, like the other person who knew LaVey was Richard Ramirez, but that's another show. So Creech and Ramirez to LaVey is known. Amongst others we don't know. And this guy's tied to Miller, like you said, is incredible. Another
And wasn't Creech he was contracted to kill Gary Hart?
Yeah. The senator that William just mentioned is not named in the article, but is named in your newspaper coverage in Creech's trial. And yeah, that was Gary Hart, the Colorado senator. And what's interesting about that too, I keep kind of going back to this because I want to make it clear that it's not just looking at Creech's claims and uncritically believing what he says, that there is corroborating evidence for a lot of what he says. The whole Gary Hart thing actually started when there was basically an inmate, a city jail inmate in Denver, who basically came forward and told police that they had been at a card game with somebody who had claimed that they were given a contract to kill Gary Hart if he won the election. And then later, this inmate saw a wanted poster for Creech, and recognized Creech as being the guy who had bragged about having this murder contract. And so he claimed that Thomas Creech was basically coming there to kill Gary Hart, potentially was going to kill Gary Hart, and that actually led to the Colorado authorities seeking out Creech because they believed that he was going to assassinate this newly elected senator. And what's also weird is that right across the street from Gary Hart's victory party at a hotel, the hotel worker did in fact find a rifle with a scope, apparently in like an empty room or something. And so there appears to be a sign that this assassination plot was real, at least a thought, indication that it was. And so this whole, it didn't come just from Creech making this stuff up. They're actually, before Creech was even arrested for these murders in Idaho, the Colorado authorities already had reason to believe that he was contracted to kill Gary Hart.
We do know that he did have a contract to kill somebody, a guy by the name of Gordon Stanton, who was a union organizer in Las Vegas.
Right.
So and then there was the other guy who tried the contract killer to kill Creech, which is Thomas Miller. But one of the other interesting things about Creech, not only is Hell's Angels, but there was like a group within the biker community. The outlaw was the Hell's Angels, and the Outlaws called
the Brotherhood.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Which, I mean, sort of like this, you'd say shadow elite, like, I guess would you describe it as this, top level, control organization that sort of, I guess, it sort of merges together these different regional biker gangs, the Banditos, the Hells Angels, the Outlaws, and you could sort of be a step above them. That was how I sort of interpreted it, that basically it's the larger national network that keeps all these different biker gangs in line to an extent and is able to sort of outsource out these different contracts. It's kind of similar to what Maury Terry talks about in his book when he's describing this, nationwide satanic cult that's able to sort of ship murder contracts back and forth between each other. If someone in New York wants someone in California killed, they know a guy and they can get it done that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Like, this is just an insight. Creech is like an insight into these underground networks of drug running and hitmen and stuff like that. And according to Creech, according to this article, this is another crazy one to, thought reform. But Creech supplied the Symbionese Liberation Army with a certain drug package, the contents of which were unknown to him from his heroin boss in Nevada. His suspicion is that these drugs were used on SLA detainee Patty Hearst, whom he claims to have seen in the San Francisco house.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
And I mean, I think there was a quote from the article right after that sort of says, when all this testimony is read and digested, it lets you know something is afoot beyond the scope of the evening news. That, like we've been saying, that these different people presented as isolated stories are really part of this underground crime network at a scale that is nearly incomprehensible.
Right. Another thing that's really interesting about the SLA stuff is it seems like in sort of these mind control programs, the occult is used quite a bit. Like for instance, the SLA, their logo. I don't know if you're familiar with the Lost Continent of Mu. It's that logo appears in a book about the Lost Continent of Mu back in the early 20th century. The seven-headed cobra.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. I'll send you some information on that one too.
That is interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize that there was seeming occult symbolism with them too. But like you say, it makes perfect sense.
Oh yeah. Just something that I've kind of noticed, like with MK Ultra type of stuff. Another thing, like I was talking with Dana about, it's like I think it's probably a mistake to think that it's just one doctor doing all the programming. Like, if you remember, like when you were in science lab in like high school, you usually had to like have your lab partner check your work for you, and you had to check his work. So in a situation like Sirhan, we believe that it's William Joseph Bryan who did most of the programming. And then later on, you also have like Jolly and West maybe examining Sirhan. And that could just easily be nothing, or it could be that Jolyon is checking Brian's work. Also, if it's like a sub program, then you're probably going to have a project manager and people working under him, right?
Yeah.
MK Ultra sub program. So it's there's all that to take into consideration.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that, and knowing what MK Ultra, I mean, even the mainstream view of it is that it was outsourced to all these different, universities and medical facilities. That there were tons of people around the country that were doing this work. So you're right; it's not just one person, and even if one individual is probably going to work with other people too. So
right,
yeah, I mean, I kind of am inclined to believe that a lot. I mean, there are many more programmers than all over the place than we would necessarily be inclined to believe. It's not just the famous ones like Jolly West either. I mean, people at all sorts of mental hospitals and prisons, names we've never even heard of, are probably involved in this too.
Right. You know what I would be really interested in, and this goes to Ted and Ted's connection to Creech, maybe. But when Ted was in San Francisco in 1968, I'd like to try to figure out his movements. Right? Did he ever visit the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic? Right, and if he did, did he register? Like, did you have to sign in? Right?
I mean, that's
you have
a
to
great
keep
question.
some record, even if it's your first visit.
Right. Yeah, I mean, because knowing all of the highly suspicious people who are probably involved in these CIA research who are at the free clinic,
Right.
that is a great question.
Yeah, and plus you've got Santa Cruz right there. And if this the cult thing is really connected to what's going on in Washington State with the 4P, right off of Boulder Creek Road, according to Michael Newman's book, Raising Hell, the Encyclopedia of Satanic Crime. That's where the 4P would have their rituals, right off of Boulder Creek Road before they did the whole Santa Ana thing, then went back and all that. But also another thing to take into consideration, it was just interesting when you mentioned the Bundy's interest in Aztec culture, is the and I guess it shows in Ann Rule's book, is doing things on a stellar timetable, right? Didn't Ann Rule get that letter from that gentleman?
Yeah, that's actually, thanks for reminding me of that. I should have mentioned that too when I was talking about the signs of a cult connection to those murders in the Pacific Northwest, the ones attributed to Bundy. That there was some kind of, I don't remember exactly how it worked, but yes, it was like some kind of lunar timetable that was sort of dictating when these murders would happen. That the previous murders up to that point had fit a certain pattern, and based on this pattern, they predicted that the next one would occur between July 13th and July 15th, and it did in fact occur on July 14th. So pretty accurate prediction if it's completely out of nowhere. Then lucky guess, or maybe they really knew they had gotten onto this pattern and there really wasn't a cult-oriented pattern to it.
Right. Wow. This whole thing has just blown my mind, George. Such a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for coming on. William, do you have anything else for George?
No, I think that's it. I mean, there's a lot of deaths that he did, a lot of killings, a lot of random killings he was involved in. So some were hits, some were satanic killings. The other thing
I do have another question. That connection in that article, American Death, the All American Death Angel, he talks about the Brotherhood, the elite biker gang. The interesting thing is that didn't Squeaky Fraud have some sort of running ins with that particular biker gang?
With which one in particular?
The Brotherhood.
That I don't know. I mean, I have if there's anything that points to this alleged group that Creech talked about, definitively existing, I think that'd be important to find. So definitely want to look that up after, and if you find it, please.
It's on her Wikipedia page. I'll send it to you.
Yeah, that would be interesting because I mean, like we were discussing, there's good indication that the Manson group had something to do with what Creech is talking about.
Right. All right, guys, we are kind of at the hour mark. Is there anything you'd like to add? You guys want to promote your work? Where can people find you? And then we'll wrap it up.
George, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, my website is cavdef.org. That's CAVDEF.org. The wiki is where the vast majority of this stuff is. There are pages on all sorts of topics, and there is a dedicated Thomas Creech page. It has links to the article that we've been talking about, and also some court documents that I obtained. Also, I'm on Twitter, CAVDEF_George, where I've posted some other stuff. I posted some articles on Creech and some police reports on Taylor and various things about this whole case.
Right. And guys, I can't say enough about CAVDEF. It's a fantastic place for researchers to go to get started in researching this stuff. If this is what you're interested in, you need to be going to CAVDEF, and you need to be going to programtokill.net. And you need to watch Rotting Jewel, and you need to watch William Ramsey. And I guess you can find me. I do a show once a month on YouTube called Killafornia. And we do kind of a pre-recorded thing on the WalterBosley.com, or just WalterBosley.com. It's sort of part 2 of the episode. Half is live and half is pre-recorded. Thank you so much again, George, for coming on. We really appreciate you so much and all the work you've done and all that you've contributed.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
I very much appreciate that. And I mean, I thank you, Todd, and thank you, William. You do all these great shows yourself to get this information out.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, guys. Thanks for your time and another great show. Again, this was about Satanic Hitman, drug runner, serial killer Thomas Creech with George of CAVDEF and Todd Wood of Killafornia. Thanks so much for your time.
Awesome. Hey, George.
We're done.
Oh, sorry.
Hold on.